Commons.
Mr. Speaker, I know the whole House will join me in paying tribute to Captain Dean Sprouting, who died in a road traffic accident in Iraq on the 31st of January. His death was not the result of enemy activity. I know members across the House will want to join me in offering condolences to his family and friends at this difficult time. Mr. Speaker, 100 years ago yesterday, women won the right to vote. And I know the whole House, from a sedentary position, Labour say some women, indeed some women, I'm pleased to say that universal suffrage did come for women 10 years later under a Conservative government. But I'm sure, Mr. Speaker, the whole House will want to join me in marking the heroic and tireless struggle that led to women having the vote, because it forever changed our nation's future. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Liz McInnes.
My constituent, Natasha Dudarenko, suffers from Fanconi anemia, a debilitating disease that carries with it a high risk of cancer. Natasha was on lifetime disability living allowance, which was removed following a PIP assessment. When Natasha appealed, she was told that because she has a degree, she does not need as much support. Now, I'm sure the Prime Minister is aware that disease and cancer are no respecters of disability, of qualifications. And I'd like to ask the Prime Minister what urgent action she will take to improve the quality and the standard of PIP assessments.
Obviously, the DWP is constantly looking at the standard of PIP assessments that are being made. I'm sorry to hear the case that the Honourable Lady has set out. I think most people will be very concerned at hearing that case. I'm very surprised at the judgment that was given in relation to that individual. Can I suggest that she sends in the detail of that case and we'll make sure that that's looked into?
Craig McKinley.
Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend will be aware of the UKIP-led Thanet Council's broken election promise to support the reopening of Manston as an airport. On the basis that the Manston site was to be redesignated as mixed use with thousands of houses, the plan was sensibly rejected by local councillors, and I salute them for doing so. Can she give me her assurance that Thanet should now be given as reasonable a time as necessary, perhaps under a new administration, to get our local plan right?
My honourable friend is right to raise this matter on behalf of his constituents. I understand that actually Thanet District Council has not adopted a local plan since 2006. And that's why my right honourable friend, the Housing Secretary, has written to the District Council to begin the formal process actually of considering intervention. And this is a very serious step, which shows that the Council has not been doing what it should be doing in relation to a local plan. So my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, is now considering whether to intervene, and he will be making an announcement in due course.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I join the Prime Minister in paying tribute to Captain Dean Sprouting from Jarrow on his death, and his family must accept our condolences on this terrible incident that happened. It is, of course, the anniversary of women first getting the right to vote in 1918, and I pay tribute to all those that campaigned all over the country to achieve that right. And we should understand that our rights come from the activities of ordinary people doing extraordinary things to bring about democracy and justice within our society. And those women that suffered grievously, being force-fed in Holloway Prison in my constituency, and those that suffered so much, need to be remembered for all time. Working-class women, as well as many other women, fought for that right, and it's one that we should all be proud of. Mr. Speaker, with crime rising, does the Prime Minister regret cutting 21,000 police officers?
Can I first of all say to the right honourable gentleman that we should be saluting all of those who were involved in that struggle to ensure that women could get the right to vote. I was very pleased yesterday to have an opportunity to meet Helen Pankhurst, the great-granddaughter of Emmeline Pankhurst, and to see that that memory is being kept going. And as I said yesterday in my speech, I myself heard about the fight by the suffragettes from my late godmother, whose mother was a suffragette and both whose parents knew the Pankhursts. He raises the issue of police numbers and crime. What we actually have seen from the crime survey is that crime is now down at record low levels. That is what has been achieved, and it's been achieved by a Conservative government that at the same time has been protecting police budgets.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, recorded crime is up by 1/5 since 2010, violent crime up by 20%, and during the period the Prime Minister was Home Secretary, £2.3 billion was cut from police budgets. Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary warns neighbourhood policing risks being eroded and the shortage of detectives is at a national crisis. Does the Prime Minister think the Inspectorate are scaremongering?
The Right Honourable Gentleman mentions the issue about recorded crime. One of the challenges that we have seen in police in recent years is ensuring that we get proper recording of particularly of certain types of crime. And I'm pleased to say that we have seen improvements over the last 7 to 8 years in the recording by police of certain types of crime. Now, he also talks about the issue of police budgets. As I've said, this is a government that is actually protecting police budgets. And I might remind the Right Honourable Gentleman that the Labour Party's former Shadow Home Secretary, now the Police and Crime Commissioner for Greater Manchester, himself said that the police could take an up to 10% cut in their budgets.
Mr. Speaker, the Inspectorate also found that the police are failing to properly record tens of thousands of offences. And in addition to the cutting of 21,000 police officers, the government's also cut 6,700 police community support officers. The Chief Constable of Bedfordshire says we do not have the resources to keep residents safe. The position is a scandal. Too many people don't feel safe and too many people aren't safe. We've just seen the highest rise in recorded crime for a quarter of a century. The Chief Constable of Lancashire said the government's police cuts had made it much more difficult to keep people safe. Is he wrong?
Can I say to the Right Honourable Gentleman, on this issue of recording crime, he mentions the Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary. It's precisely because when I was Home Secretary, I asked HMIC to look at the recording of police crime to make sure that police forces were doing it properly. And indeed, some changes were made as a result of that. So we now see the better recording of crime. We also see £450 million extra being made available to the police. But what have we also seen over the last few years? The creation of the National Crime Agency, our police forces taking more notice of helping to support vulnerable victims, doing more on modern slavery, doing more on domestic violence, taking issues seriously that they weren't taking seriously before.
Mr. Speaker, if you ask the Inspector to look at unrecorded crime and they tell you what's going on, the least you can do is act on what they tell you. Mr. Speaker, if I could quote something at the Prime Minister, it might sound familiar to her. The first duty of the government is to protect the public and keep them safe. And I have to say to the government that they are not putting enough focus on police resources. If she casts her eyes to the far back benches of the Conservative Party, she'll see the member for Shipley. That's what he said about her government and what it's doing. Gun crime, Mr. Speaker, has increased by 20% in the last year. The Chief Constable of Merseyside said recently, "Have I got sufficient resources to fight gun crime?" No, I haven't. Does the Prime Minister think he's crying wolf?
The Right Honourable Gentleman can't get away from the fact that what the government is doing is protecting police budgets. In fact, not just protecting police budgets, but increasing with £450 million extra. What we are also doing is ensuring that our police have the powers that they need to do the job that we want them to do. I seem to remember the Right Honourable Gentleman doesn't have that good a record when it comes to increasing the powers for the police to do their job.
Mr. Speaker, since 2015, direct government funding to the police has fallen by £413 million. The Chief Constable of the West Midlands, Dave Thompson, said the current flat cash settlement for policing means force budgets will fall in real terms. As well as police cuts, other public service cuts are clearly contributing to the rise in crime. 3,600 youth workers have lost their jobs. 600 youth centres closed and boarded up. Probation service cut and privatised. Reoffenders committing more offences. When it comes to tackling crime, prevention and cure are two sides of the same coin. So why is the government cutting both prevention and cure?
I have to say to the right honourable gentleman, we've put in place various pieces of work on anti-knife crime, on serious violence, on issues like domestic violence. But I come back to the point I made in my last response. The Leader of the Opposition, the right honourable gentleman, voted against changing the law so that anyone caught carrying a knife for a second time would face a custodial sentence. He has called for much shorter sentences for those who break the law. And he might want to reflect on the fact that when there was a Conservative mayor in London, knife crime went down. Now there's a Labour mayor in London, knife crime is going up.
Jeremy Corbyn!
Mr. Speaker, I am very clear that crime is, of course, wrong. The way you deal with it is by an effective probation service, is by community service orders, is by the rehabilitation of offenders. And what she said goes to the heart of the Prime Minister's record. She, Mr. Speaker, was Home Secretary for 6 years. Crime is up, violent crime rising, police numbers down, and chief constables saying they no longer have the resources to keep communities safe. After 7 years of cuts, will the Prime Minister today admit that her government's relentless cuts to police, probation services and social services have left us less safe? The reality is you can't have public safety on the cheap.
Well, the right honourable gentleman really needs to reflect on what Labour would be doing if they were in government. You can only pay for our public services if you have a strong economy. And what would we see? What would we see with the Labour Party? Well, we don't need to ask ourselves what we'd see with the Labour Party, because the Shadow Chancellor's advisor told us at the weekend. He said this: we need to think about the obvious problems which might face a radical Labour government, such as capital flight or a run on the pound. That's what Labour would do. Bankrupt Britain, and the police would have less money under Labour than under the Conservatives.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Travelling around the country and meeting people from diverse communities, members of the Jewish and the Muslim community have raised the point for the Coroner's Act to specifically take into account people's faith considerations, as in their faith, loved ones must be buried within 24 hours. Will the Prime Minister join me and the Honourable Member for Maidstone and faith communities to look at this very important matter?
Can I say to my honourable friend, I'd like to thank him for raising this point, because he's doing so on behalf of communities across the country, and he does so from a unique position with his own experience and understanding of these issues. It is important that we take into account specific requirements of someone's faith, especially when they've lost a loved one and are grieving. And I know that although, as he will be aware, coroners are an independent judicial office, I understand that the Ministry of Justice is speaking to the Chief Coroner about this point to see what more can be done. And I'm sure that my right honourable friend, the Lord Chancellor, will be happy to meet and discuss this issue further with my honourable friend.
And Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday it was announced that 10 Royal Bank of Scotland branches in Scotland that had been earmarked for closure are to be reprieved. I'm grateful for that news, which is on the back of community pressure and the leadership which has been shown by the Scottish National Party on this issue. On 3 occasions, I have asked the Prime Minister at Prime Minister's questions to bring Ross McEwen into 10 Downing Street, for the Prime Minister to accept her responsibilities given we own RBS. Now we've saved 10 branches. Will the Prime Minister call in Ross McEwen and join us and call for all the branches to remain open?
I say to the right honourable gentleman, as I've said before, of course it's important that customers, especially those who are vulnerable, can call on the services that they need. Obviously, I welcome the decision from Royal Bank of Scotland. This is, as I've said, commercial decisions for them. But if the right honourable gentleman is so keen on ensuring that communities and people perhaps in remote communities have access to the services that they need, he should ask himself why it is that the Scottish Government has been such a failure in ensuring that people in remote communities have broadband access to online banking. They need to get their act together because, quite simply, Scotland under the Nats is getting left behind.
Ian Blackford.
Mr. Speaker, that was pathetic. The Prime Minister hasn't lifted a finger. We've saved the banks. Mr. Speaker, yesterday we celebrated the achievements of the suffragette movement, which was about democracy, equality and fairness for women. However, today in the United Kingdom, 3.8 million women are not receiving the pension they are entitled to. A vote in this House last November received unanimous cross-party support, 288 to 0, calling on the government in London to do the right thing. Will the Prime Minister do her bit for gender equality and end the injustice faced by 1950s women?
To the right honourable gentleman that as people are living longer, it is important that we equalise the retirement age the pension age between men and women. We are doing that. We are doing that faster. We have already acted to give greater protection to the women involved. An extra £1 billion has been put in to ensure that nobody is going to see their pension entitlement changed by more than 18 months. That was a real response to the issue that was being addressed. But I think if he wants to talk about equality, then he has to recognise the importance of the equality of the state pension age between men and women.
Mr. Philip Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I never thought I'd see the day where I lead, the leader of the opposition follows. There's clearly hope for him yet. Mr. Speaker, last year the government advertised for the post of Disability Commissioner. Lord Shinquin, my noble friend, applied for the position and was appointed to the position. Yet only a few weeks later he was told by the Equality and Human Rights Commission that the post had been abolished altogether. Was the Prime Minister consulted about that decision? Does she agree with the decision to abolish that post? And if not, can I ask her to urge the Equality and Human Rights Commission to reinstate the post of Disability Commissioner and reinstall Lord Shinquin to his rightful place on that?
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for raising this point, and can I first of all say I've known the noble Lord Shinquin for many, many years. He has been a valiant champion of the rights of disabled people over those years, and I think his own experience and the example that he sets in his work in public life, and particularly in the other place, are a fine example of how disabled people can actually be standing up, speaking up, and ensuring that they're taking their rightful place in public life. On this issue of the Disability Commissioner, the EHRC is an independent body. It was their decision to abolish the Disability Commissioner. The question is, what is being done to help disabled people, and how can we ensure we're helping disabled people? And that's why we are committed to tackling the injustices that disabled people face. We're spending over £50 billion a year on benefits to support disabled people and people with health conditions. That's a record high. But of course, we do want to ensure, and I would urge the EHRC to ensure that in their work they are paying proper attention to the needs and rights of disabled people, because that is an important part of their remit.
Jenny Chapman.
Mr. Speaker, my constituent's son was killed by a learner driver taking a lesson, with 1 in 4 young drivers being involved in an accident within the first 2 years of starting to drive, and 400 deaths or serious injuries on our roads involving young drivers each year, will the Prime Minister meet with me and my constituents to hear their story and consider the introduction of a graduated licensing system for the UK as they have in other countries?
The Honourable Lady has obviously raised an important issue, and I will certainly look at the requests that she has made, and I will also ask the Department of Transport to look at this as an issue. And as she says, there are too many people who suffer loss and tragedy at the hands of learner drivers in these circumstances, and we will certainly look at that.
Dr. Andrew Murison.
The Royal Marines are the most adaptable of our elite infantry. They are central to our amphibious capability and they provide much of our special forces. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that reducing them further at this stage would be inconsistent with this government's strong record on defence and security?
Well, can I say to my honourable friend that the Royal Marines do indeed play a vital role in defending our country, and I pay tribute to them for all that they do. Protecting the UK is, of course, our priority, and as my honourable friend will know, we have in place now a review, a modernising defence programme, which is about ensuring that the defence capabilities we have meet the rapidly changing and evolving threats that we face. I think that's the right thing for us to do, but of course any comments that have been made, any suggestions that have been made about cuts to defence are purely speculative. And I would remind my honourable friend and other members of this House that in fact we are committed to increasing our spending on defence.
In offering him best wishes for his birthday on Sunday, I call Mr. Dennis Skinner.
Well, I didn't know about that. I don't celebrate things like that. I don't think you should celebrate age. Anyway, there are another group of people that need help, and they're the people that work in the National Health Service. Yes. And what they told me last week was the best period that they ever experienced was in the Labour government when they had the money increased from £33 billion in 1997 to £100 billion in 2010. That was a golden period. Why did they do it? How did they do it? The Chancellor of the Exchequer put 1% on the national insurance, and in hypothecation terms, that went directly to the health service, and it's called long-term stability. Under this government, they don't know whether they're coming or going. It's high time this government did the same as we did between 97 and 2010. Get weaving.
Happy birthday, Dennis. Can I say to the honourable gentleman, he says, why were the Labour Party in that position of being able to spend more on public services? I'll tell him why. Because a Conservative government had left a golden economic legacy.
Mr. Costa, I don't think you knew how popular you are. Mr. Costa,
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Conservative-led Harborough District Council have recently refused IDI Gaisley's proposed expansion of the enormous Magna Park logistics park in my constituency. Given the Prime Minister's recent welcome remarks about sustainable developments, will she please arrange for me to meet the relevant government ministers to discuss the creation of a national planning framework for the future location of these enormous logistics parks?
My honourable friend has raised an important point, and obviously this is a matter that is of considerable interest to his constituents. Of course, we need to get the right balance between enabling development and therefore growth to take place while continuing to protect and enhance our natural environment. And the purpose of the planning system is to contribute to achieving that sustainable development. But with regard to the very specific issue about these logistics parks, I'm sure that one of the ministers from Housing and Communities and Local Government, indeed possibly my right honourable friend the Housing Secretary, will be happy to meet with him and discuss it with him.
Killen.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Is the Prime Minister aware if a universal credit claimant forgets their username or password, they must attend a face-to-face interview at a job centre to have them reset? The Secretary of State can't give a date when this will be fixed, so will the Prime Minister commit to no further job centre closures until universal credit claimants can access basic online functions as available in the case of HMRC and banking?
I will ask my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, to look carefully at ensuring that a date is identified when that change is going to be made.
Alex Shelbrooke.
Mr Speaker, according to library statistics, around 3,400 people in my constituency in Rothwell last year were diagnosed with cancer. Cancer survival rates has meant there are 7,000 people alive today who may not have been if the cancer survival rates of 2010 were still in place. Does my right honourable friend see this as a testament to the NHS, the investment in the government, and does she welcome the news but recognise there's more we can be doing?
Well, I absolutely agree, my friend, with my honourable friend. It's very good news that there are 7,000 more people alive today, cancer sufferers who are alive today than we would have been had we simply continued in the way that we were at 2010. I'm very happy to join him in welcoming that news. Cancer survival rates have increased year on year. Of course, we want them to increase even further. Last year, we had 7 million more diagnostic tests than in 2010, and 290,000 patients started treatment for cancer. That's 57,000 more than in 2010, but he's absolutely right. We should welcome the improvement that's been made. We should congratulate those and thank the NHS staff for all they've been doing, but there is more for us to do. And that's why we're backing up our plans for cancer with a further £600 million to implement the cancer strategy for England.
Stephen Morgan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Prime Minister, as we've just heard, continues to be in denial about the rising level of crime and falling police numbers. Despite her repeated assurances, budgets have not been protected for my local police force, with 80 million and 1,000 police officers lost already. Will she meet with me and a delegation of Portsmouth small businesses that do so much for my local economy, yet have seen significant rises and break-ins in crime as a result of these Tory cuts?
Well, I say to the honourable gentleman that for those, obviously I will look at his request, but for those who are concerned about the way in which policing is being undertaken in their area, then they should actually speak to the local police who make operational decisions about what is happening. We protected overall police spending, and we continue to protect overall police spending. Indeed, more money is being put into the police. And I remind the honourable gentleman that it was a Labour shadow Home Secretary who said that the police budgets could be cut by 10%.
Derek Thomas.
NHS figures show that in the South West, NHS funding is the growth in NHS funding is 2.2% less than the national average. It's also true that it's more challenging in the South West with an ageing demographic and sparsity. Does the Prime Minister agree with my friend, the Prime Minister, agree with me that providers in the South West, including NHS Kernow, deserve their fair share of NHS funding, and will she take action to address this inequality?
I would say to my honourable friend that the national formula that, of course, is the basis for calculating the funding for CCGs does take into account a large number of factors, including rurality and including demographics, which are the factors that he has suggested need to be considered. NHS Kernow did see an increase in their funding this year and will see a further increase in their funding next year, taking funding to over £760 million. This is part of our commitment to ensuring that we are putting extra funding into the NHS, but of course we continue to look at ensuring that the distribution of that funding takes account of all the factors that it needs to.
Leila Moran.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Under the 1824 Vagrancy Act, rough sleeping is illegal. The Act was used nearly 2,000 times last year to drag homeless people before the courts. Scotland and Northern Ireland have already repealed it. So will the Prime Minister support my bill that consigns this heartless Dickensian law to the history books across the whole of the United Kingdom?
What we are doing is recognising that we do need to take action in relation to rough sleeping. That's why we're putting more money into projects to reduce rough sleeping, and indeed projects like Housing First, which are being put into place in a number of places in the country to ensure that we can provide for those who are rough sleeping. None of us want to see anybody rough sleeping on our streets. That's why the government is taking action.
Sir William Cash. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today is the anniversary of the signing of the Maastricht Treaty. We have come a very long way. May I congratulate my right honourable friend on her approach to the customs union. May I also mention the fact that in the liaison committee last December, I warned her about ultimatums from the EU, and again in my UQ only last week. Would she be good enough to be very robust when discussing these matters in the Brexit committees? I'm sure she will be, in order to ensure that we repudiate any of these EU threats.
I can assure my honourable friend. First of all, I suspect that at the time that the legislation was going through in this House, there weren't many who would have thought my honourable friend would be standing up recognising the anniversary of the signing of the Maastricht Treaty. I suspect he only feels able to do so because we are coming out of the European Union, and I can assure him we will be robust in our arguments. As I've said right from the very beginning, we will hear noises off, we will hear all sorts of things being said about positions that are being taken. What matters is the positions that we take in the negotiations as we sit down and negotiate the best deal. We've shown we can do that. We did it in December, and we're going to do it again.
Elmer Walker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Kirklees Council, who serve my constituency of Combe Valley, have already had their budget cut by nearly £200 million, with a possible £45 million of cuts to come. Which of the following things would the Prime Minister recommend they cut next? Care for an older person with dementia, emptying the bins, providing hot school meals for vulnerable children, libraries, leisure centres or museums, or supporting the 24% of children living in poverty? Your choice, Prime Minister.
I would have thought that the Honourable Lady should have been welcoming the improvements that have taken place in her constituency, should have welcomed the many more children who are in good or outstanding schools as a result of this government, should have welcomed the extra health funding, should have welcomed the more people who...
The Prime Minister is in the middle of giving her answer. Well, maybe she'd concluded it, but she might order. Members mustn't shout at the Prime Minister when she's giving her answer. No? OK. Chris Phil.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Recent reports have suggested that the European Commission is asking that we enter into certain limited, legally binding agreements in relation to bits of our exit in isolation. Could the Prime Minister confirm that it remains the government's policy that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, and therefore we'll only enter into a legally binding agreement in relation to the entire exit agreement and not just parts of it?
Well, my honourable friend is right, and it was reflected in the joint report that was published in December that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. There are the negotiations that are now taking place are, first of all, to put greater detail into the definition of the implementation period, and we expect to do that by the March European Council. Alongside that, there is the looking at the legal basis of the withdrawal agreement, which of course will have to come to this Parliament for agreement with both of those, as the withdrawal agreement and implementation bill in due course. At that stage, I would expect to have the future relationship set out in a way so that people are able to look at the whole package when they come to make that decision.
Sir Vincent Cable.
The Prime Minister knows that one of the key objectives of American trade negotiators in any future deal after Brexit is to secure access for American companies to business in the NHS. Can she give an absolute guarantee that in those negotiations the NHS will be excluded from their scope? And can she confirm that in her conversations with President Trump, she's made it absolutely clear to him that the NHS is not for sale?
Well, I have to say to the right honourable gentleman that we are starting the discussions with the American administration. First of all, looking at what we can do to increase trade between the US and the United Kingdom already, even before the possibility of any free trade agreement. And he doesn't know what they're going to say in their requirements for that free trade agreement. We will go into those negotiations to get the best possible deal for the United Kingdom.
Michelle Donnellan.
Mr. Speaker, a recent report by Oakland Laws highlights the top countries that suffer horrific persecution against Christians. We need to take action and send a signal to other nations. These are countries that are often associated with luxury holidays. Will the Prime Minister consider earmarking a specific fixed percentage of international aid to go towards tackling religious persecution?
Yes, well, I have to say to my honourable friend that this is an issue that I know is of concern to many members of this House. And I was pleased a matter of weeks ago to meet Father Daniel from Nineveh and Idlib, who talked about the very real persecution that his congregation were suffering and had suffered in the past. And he presented me with a Bible which was burnt, had been rescued when a church had actually been set on fire. This is a real issue. All of our aid is distributed on the basis of need to ensure that civilians are not discriminated against on the basis of race, ethnicity or religion. And we are working with governments, the international community and the United Nations to support the rights of minorities and to ensure our aid does reach those in need. But we will, of course, further explore what more support we can give to not the persecution of religious minorities.
Remain.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister will be aware that all free trade agreements involve some customs checks and therefore infrastructure at frontiers which would be completely incompatible with maintaining an open border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. As the Cabinet Subcommittee is apparently today finally getting round to discussing this, could the Prime Minister explain to the House why she is so opposed to the UK remaining in a customs union with the EU, when not only would this be better for the British economy than a vague, deep and special partnership, whatever that is, but would help to ensure that that border remains as it is today, which is what all of us want.
The United Kingdom is leaving the European Union. That means we're leaving the single market, we're leaving the customs union, because if we were full members of the customs union, we would not be able to do trade deals around the rest of the world, and we're going to have an independent trade policy and do those deals. And he asks me about customs arrangements. Well, I have to say to him that I suggest he looks at the paper that was published by the government last summer.
Robert Halfon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Headway, the brain injury charity, says that a family recently had to pay £1,500 over 15 weeks for hospital car parking charges. Click Sergeant say families who see their sick children with cancer have to pay hundreds of pounds. Despite government guidelines, 50% of hospitals charge the disabled, and staff from nurses to hospital porters have to pay hospital car parking charges. Given the unanimous motion last week in the House of Commons, will my honourable friend address this social injustice and abolish hospital car parking charges once and for all?
I recognise that this is an issue that my honourable friend has been campaigning on for some time. As he says in his question, we have, of course, set strong guidance to national health to hospital trusts on the issue of car parking charges, and we do, of course, look to ensure that those are being met. Of course, individual hospitals are taking their own decisions in relation to this matter, but I think it's right that the government has set very clear guidelines to those hospitals as to how they should approach this.
Ellen Goodman.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has done much to tackle modern slavery, but my constituent was trafficked here as a child, sold at least once on the long journey, and then forced to work in the dark in a cannabis factory for years. Now the Home Office is proposing to send him back to Vietnam. Will the Prime Minister intervene, not just in this case, but in this complex and confused area of the law?
I recognise, as the Honourable Lady says, that there are cases which are complex in terms of the legal application. My right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, has heard the case that the Honourable Lady has set out, and I'm sure will look at that particular issue, both the individual case but also the wider point that the Honourable Lady is making. But I'm sure we all want to ensure that actually, as we know, the best possible solution to this is for people like her constituent not to be trafficked into the UK in the first place, to be working in these cannabis factories.
Like many, I'm delighted to note the good progress in lifting the ban on beef exports to China. What is my right honourable friend doing to ensure that we are able to export Scots beef and other Scottish products, such as whisky, to other parts or all parts of the world?
Well, can I say to my honourable friend, I was very pleased that when I was in China last week, we were able to work with the Chinese government towards that opening up of the Chinese market, particularly to beef products and also to dairy products, which are two key issues for the United Kingdom. But also, I'm pleased to say that the Chief Executive of the Scotch Whisky Association was on the business delegation with me and was doing everything that she does most ably to promote the interests of Scotch whisky. And, of course, the answer to his question is that what we're doing is making sure that we can have an independent trade policy, developing trade deals around the rest of the world, which means that good Scottish products, and indeed good products from the rest of the UK, can be sold around the world.
Mr. Speaker, the centuries-old GKN, a world-class company, Britain's third biggest engineering company, is facing a hostile takeover by Melrose, leading to break-up, sell-off, closures and redundancies. That would be to make a mockery of industrial strategy. Can I ask the Prime Minister this? The government has the power to intervene because of the defence work carried out by GKN. Will the Prime Minister act in the national interest and block this unwanted takeover?
I can say to the honourable gentleman that, of course, the Business Department will be looking closely and have been following closely the issue that he has raised, and I can assure him that I and the government as a whole will always act in the UK national interest.
With one of the largest undeveloped brownfield sites in the country located in my constituency at Stanton, will my right honourable friend explain to the House how the new Housing Infrastructure Fund will help Erewash residents buy a new home?
Well, can I say to my honourable friend that I think the Housing Infrastructure Fund is a very important development. One of the major complaints that constituents often have and residents have when they see the possibility of development in their area is lack of infrastructure. What the Housing Infrastructure Fund enables is that infrastructure to be built, to be put in place, so it can support developments in a way that helps support local residents. I'm very pleased with the announcement of nearly £900 million, which the Housing Secretary announced last week. We're seeing real interest in the Housing Infrastructure Fund. That's making a difference. It's enabling more homes to be built and more of her constituents to be able to buy their own home.
Speaker, my constituent's 58. She has COPD, 4 pins in her leg, a walking frame and is just out of hospital after having blood clots in her lung. She got a taxi to Bridgeton Job Centre yesterday, only to find the doors locked because the government closed it on Friday. Will she apologise for not having told my constituents, any of the constituents apparently in Bridgeton, whose job centres were being closed? Will she refund my constituent the £10 she spent in a taxi? And will she apologise for this absolutely ridiculous situation?
I say to the honourable lady that yes, we are seeing some job centres being closed in Scotland. There's not going to be any decrease in the level of service that is offered to the people of Scotland. We're increasing the number of work coaches across the country. What we're doing is ensuring that we can continue to provide a good service to the people of Scotland.
Vicky Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Intimidation on social media is a growing issue for many people across the country, and yesterday highlighted it especially for women standing for election. Can my right honourable friend update us on the progress that's being made, and does she agree we should take no lessons from a party whose shadow chancellor has called for violence against women on this side?
Yes, can I say to my honourable friend that I think this issue is a particularly important one. I did announce yesterday, I said yesterday, as indeed my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, had said at the weekend, that we are consulting on a new offence of intimidation of election candidates and campaigners. That follows the report from Lord Bew and his committee about the degree to which there was intimidation at the last general election, particularly intimidation of women, BME candidates and LGBT candidates. This is an absolute disgrace. It has no part in our public life. And I would urge the Shadow Chancellor once again, and he keeps refusing to do this, to apologise to the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions for saying she should be lynched.
Order! And Prime Minister's questions comes to an end. It's just after 1:45. Jeremy Corbyn went on a little bit of a surprise to some of us. He went on police numbers and police funding. Interesting, because the sort of law and order regarded as kind of Tory issue. Mr. Corbyn decided to move in on this, and using effective use of statistics, he did pretty well. He talked about the cut in police officers of 21,000, that when she had been Home Secretary, Mrs. May, there had been a 2.3 billion cut in real terms on police budgets. He claimed the highest rise in recorded crime in 25 years. And of course, when you get into crime figures, there's always an argument between the recorded crime and the survey crime. Recorded crime being what the police actually log, survey crime being people asked if they have been victims of crime, and if so, what. And he also pointed out that there were 6,700 fewer community police now. Mrs. May batted back with some figures using the survey figures, because they don't show the same fall in crime. And Mr. Corbyn was pretty much on top of things, though he did find himself uttering the sentence, "crime is wrong," which I guess shouldn't be a surprise coming from the Leader of Her Majesty's opposition. Well, still with me, the International Trade Minister, Greg Hands, Shadow Transport Minister, Rachel Masco, Laura Koonsberg as well. Interesting now that Mr. Corbyn feels comfortable even on the law and order front.
That's right, and I think that the Labour Party learned during the general election that that was an issue that could play to their advantage. If you think back then to the summer, of course, in the context of the terrible terror attacks, this really became an issue in the closing stages of the general election campaign that raced up the political agenda. And although, as you say, traditionally law and order is a Tory issue, the Labour Party managed really quite successfully to push on that issue in the general election campaign and play to, some of the worry and anxieties among members of the public at crime going up, depending on which survey you really believe, and on police services around the country, time and again, as chief constables warn, being under very real pressure.
Is it broadly true that if you use the recorded crime, the recent figures, it shows a rise? I think that's what Mr. Corbyn referred to. If you use the survey figures, you don't get the same rise.
That's right. And as you say, traditionally there is this debate between things that are noted down when someone goes off to a police station to report something, and then the things that people report when they are asked face to face. But what the Office for National Statistics, who of course doesn't have an axe in this fight, the neutral body, said after the last lot of statistics came out, they said that some of the recent rise is down to better recording. So some of it is because more people are coming forward rather than society somehow being more dangerous.
And that's what Mrs. May was referring to when she talked about the change of methodology.
That's right. But what they also say, again, the ONS independently did say, there does seem to be a genuine rise in violent crimes. So a mixed picture, but you can't just shrug off all of the perceived increases, say, oh, they just count it a different way.
Right, interesting. What do you think that Mr. Corbyn is now able to move on to your turf?
Well, I disagree. I thought it was extraordinary that Corbyn felt, after 2.5 years as leader of the opposition, that he had to say crime is wrong. And I thought Theresa May was very effective in pointing out all of the different tougher crime laws, tougher anti-crime laws that Corbyn himself had voted against. If you look at his record over the last 30 years in Parliament, he as an individual has voted against a whole raft of different crime measures, whether they be terrorism, street crime, etc., etc. So I think Corbyn is very vulnerable, actually.
He didn't vote for the 21,000 cut in police officers.
Well, but as with all these things, Andrew, is Corbyn is unable to come up with. Every week he appears at Prime Minister's Question Time, he pledges more and more money for all kinds of different things. there's never any sense of where this money is going to come from. The actual reality is that Labour, if they were in charge, would crash the economy. There'd be far less money available. As the Prime Minister makes clear, you've got to have a growing economy to pay for these public services in the first place.
The ONS says, from its report of January the 25th, using the latest figures, our assessment is that crime levels continue to fall, consistent with long-term trends, but not all types of crime have fallen. So was that scaremongering we saw from Mr Corbyn?
Well, if you look at the types of crime which are seriously rising, we've got violent crime up 20%, we've got sexual crime rising, we've got issues around online cybercrime really skyrocketing at the moment. So it is going up, and that's of real concern to the public. And ultimately, a policy has got to be about public safety. And what Mr Corbyn really did emphasise was addressing the causes of crime, and those issues clearly not being addressed with the cuts to youth services and money being withdrawn from local authorities to keep communities safer.
The ONS points out that it is police recorded crime that is the main source of evidence for rises in knife and gun crime, sort of violent crime that you've been talking about. And of course, that is the kind of, I mean, there are many crimes that happen that are not reported, but the survey picks them up. But of course, knife and gun crime, most of that is pretty much reported, and it shows quite a serious rise.
Well, I think we're all acknowledging that there are issues there around knife and gun crime. Particularly, I might say, in London, around where I am, there has definitely been an appreciable rise and also a perception of that rise. The overall crime survey... Which
just remind our viewers when you say where you're...
I'm the MP for Chelsea and Fulham.
Sure.
But the overall crime survey, which is reckoned to be a better estimate overall, as the Prime Minister said, is at a record low in terms of overall crime in this country.
But 80 in the City of London, by that I mean Greater London, not the financial district, 80 fatalities from knife crime last year. 80. Well, that's the kind of figure you associate with an American city. 80.
Well, that is a question which is best put to Sadiq Khan. In actual fact, government funding for police in London has been very good, and the number of police officers in London has remained pretty constant at around 31,000 since the Olympics. So the question there is how the operation and how police resources are allocated within London
so it's
by
the
Mayor
Mayor's
of London.
responsibility, not central government's.
It is the Mayor's responsibility to allocate those police resources. The resources are good, and actually the number of officers overall has been pretty constant at around 31,000.
But it's not just in London, it's right across the country, and that point must not be missed. I mean, I'm certainly seeing where we've got Conservatives running our police service that crime is also rising.
So it's kind of politically blind, is what you said. It doesn't really matter who's in charge locally, it's going up.
Well, it's about how those resources are allocated. And as we've heard 21,000 police officers cut, and that does have a significant impact on what happens on crime.
Coming back to Europe, which these days there is no escape. By the way, I just point out, which we didn't when we were talking about Germany earlier, one of the remarkable developments of the creation of a CDU, CSU, SPD coalition government, which still has to be approved by SPD members, is that a hard right party is now the official opposition in Germany, with 93 members in the Bundestag. It is now the biggest party outside the three that will form the coalition. A party on most things well to the right of UKIP. And so that is quite a remarkable development, which perhaps...
It certainly is, and it's a cause for anxiety among many political circles.
And it's a consequence of recreating the Grand Coalition.
Well, they are now therefore out on their own, able to criticise and not sort of bought in. But if you like, it was a very, very difficult situation in Germany for Angela Merkel.
Indeed, no, it was. But it's an interesting development, that far right now, and that means they get crucial committees in the Bundestag as the official opposition. Anyway, George Osborne, he used to be your boss, didn't he?
I was Chief Secretary of the Treasury under George as Chancellor. Yeah.
There you go. Good man?
Yeah, he's a good man.
Sound man?
He was a good person to work for.
Sound judgment, good Chancellor?
Well, he's now doing a different job.
Sure, no, I didn't ask about that, but with sound Chancellor, you think?
He did a very good job as Chancellor of the Exchequer. He reduced the deficit by 3/4 that we inherited.
No, good, good, that's fine. Because he's written in the Standard this morning, given that you think he's a sound man on economic matters, there's no escaping the simple economic truth. Outside of a customs union, the cost of things we buy will go up. The opportunities for British firms to sell abroad will be reduced. Britain will have consciously engaged in the biggest act of protectionism in our history. Sound man?
I disagree with that.
You do?
Because I think if we were to stay in the customs union but have no say over the rules which determine the common external tariff and determine the EU's trade policy, I think it would be the worst of all worlds.
So he's wrong when he says that the cost of things will go up if we leave the customs union?
Well, if you actually look at the modelling, most of the modelling that has been done does not include the scenario laid out by the Prime Minister in her Florence speech. So in actual fact, the different modelling that's been done at different points, none of it actually includes the scenario, the optimal scenario that the UK government is trying to negotiate. That is the important thing.
Okay, and the modelling from your old department, which tries to model certain free trade deals, it says that a free trade deal with America, the single biggest economy in the world, would add only 0.2% to our GDP, 0.2%. Do you agree with that?
Well, I haven't seen that specific modelling. They also say, I think, at the same time that all of the other free trade agreements would also add less than 0.2%, and that seems a little unusual. The second thing I would say...
If that's right, a free trade deal does not compensate for leaving the customs union, does it?
Well, don't forget that this modelling does not include the government scenario that we want to have in terms of the Florence...
So you're the government. Why isn't the civil service producing modelling that reflects government policy? You are the government, aren't you? Indeed, you're the international trade minister. Why don't you get a model that suits your policy?
Okay, because that modelling is in development, yes? It's not that the process is not finished. And so what
Paris,
we like...
Berlin, London?
Well, no, what the modelling should include, Andrew, in an ideal world, is include all of the scenarios that we would like to achieve.
So why doesn't it, since they're your government
Because the modelling hasn't been finished yet.
Oh, so it's now going to do modelling based on the government's...
Well, I'm saying that the document that was put out there was a draft, an early form of modelling. It's not for me
So is it going to do the modelling of the foreign trade, the international trade scenario you would like to see?
Well, what it has done is taken selectively, for example, it assumes the US FTA is done.
Well, that's what I asked
but it
you
does,
about,
well, hold on, but it doesn't
0.2%,
say that the other FTAs would be done in that modelling. And that's the
we
important
need
thing
to
understand.
give, far more important than free trade agreements or customs union, the answer to Guess the Year.